Imagine sitting at your kitchen table, looking over your budget for the month. You've got rent, groceries, utilities, and a few other expenses. You also have a credit card bill that's racking up interest. Now, what if I told you this scenario mirrors a much larger issue that countries deal with? The difference between your monthly spending and what you earn is like a government's deficit. And that growing credit card balance, that's the debt. While they sound similar, debt and deficit are distinct concepts, and understanding them is key to making sense of economic policies and national finances. Today, we're going to break down the difference between debt and deficit in a way that's simple, relatable, and engaging. Let's get started. To make sense of these terms, think of a country's finances like your personal budget, only on a much grander scale. Every year, governments decide how much money they'll spend and how much they'll collect in taxes. If they spend more than they earn, they run a deficit for that year. But deficits don't exist in isolation. They add up over time to create debt. It's like when you overspend on your credit card every month. Eventually, those monthly deficits pile up into one big balance that becomes harder and harder to pay off. This is the essence of debt and deficit. But there's much more to the story. Let's start with deficits. A deficit occurs when a government spends more than it earns in a given year. For example, imagine the government collects $4 trillion in taxes, but spends $5 trillion on programs like healthcare, education, and defense. That extra $1 trillion that it didn't have, that's the deficit. Deficits are often financed by borrowing, which brings us to the concept of debt. Debt is the accumulation of all past deficits, minus any surpluses. Think of it like a running tab at a restaurant. Each year of overspending adds to the tab, creating a larger debt. For instance, the United States national debt is the result of decades of deficits, as well as interest on borrowed money. It's like a snowball rolling downhill, growing larger with every turn. To understand how these concepts interact, let's look at a real-world example. During the Great Recession of 2008, the U.S. government ran massive deficits to fund stimulus packages and bailouts. These actions were necessary to stabilize the economy, but they added significantly to the national debt. Similarly, during the COVID-19 pandemic, governments around the world borrowed heavily to provide relief to citizens and businesses. These measures created enormous deficits, but they also prevented economic collapse. However, the debt from these deficits will take years, if not decades, to manage. Now, here's an important question. Is debt always bad? The answer is no. Just like a person might take out a loan to buy a house or start a business, governments borrow to invest in infrastructure, education, and other areas that drive long-term growth. The key is whether the borrowed money is being used wisely. If a country's economy grows faster than its debt, the borrowing pays off. But if debt grows faster than the economy, it can lead to problems like higher interest payments and reduced flexibility in future budgets. This brings us to the concept of debt-to-GDP ratio, a critical metric that economists use to assess a country's financial health. It compares a nation's debt to its annual economic output. For example, a debt-to-GDP ratio of 100% means a country's debt equals its total economic production for the year. While high debt-to-GDP ratios can be alarming, they're not always catastrophic. Japan, for instance, has one of the highest debt-to-GDP ratios in the world, but it remains a stable economy due to strong institutions and domestic ownership of its debt. Let's also talk about the role of interest rates. When a government borrows money, it pays interest to its creditors. If interest rates are low, borrowing is relatively cheap, making it easier for governments to run deficits without significantly increasing their debt burden. However, when interest rates rise, the cost of borrowing goes up and managing debt becomes more challenging. It's like carrying a balance on your credit card. The higher the interest rate, the more expensive it is to keep borrowing. So, why do deficits and debt matter to you? For one, they can influence the economy in profound ways. High levels of debt can lead to inflation, reduced public investment, and even economic instability. Imagine if a government spends most of its budget on interest payments rather than on schools, hospitals, or roads. That's money that could have been used to improve the quality of life for citizens. On the flip side, deficits and debt can also be tools for economic recovery. For example, during a recession, governments often increase spending to stimulate demand and create jobs, even if it means running a deficit. The challenge is finding the right balance between short-term needs and long-term sustainability. One way governments manage debt is through fiscal policy. By adjusting taxes and spending, they can either stimulate the economy or rein in deficits. For instance, raising taxes can help reduce a deficit, but might slow economic growth. Cutting spending can achieve the same goal, but often comes at the expense of essential programs. It's a delicate balancing act. Much like walking a tightrope, lean too far in one direction, and the consequences can be severe. Now that we've explored the difference between debt and deficit, let's reflect on what we've learned. Deficits are annual shortfalls, while debt is the accumulation of those shortfalls over time. Both are critical tools for managing an economy, but they require careful oversight to avoid long-term problems. Understanding these concepts isn't just about numbers. It's about understanding the trade-offs and decisions that shape our world. But here's the thing. Debt and deficits are deeply connected to another key economic concept: interest rates. How do rising or falling interest rates affect borrowing, saving, and the economy as a whole? That's the topic of our next video: how interest rates affect the economy. And if you missed our previous video on what is a recession and how to prepare for it, don't worry, it's just a click away. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.